here we are in my garden, and my garden is actually where I don't actually live. Everybody always says, do you live here? No, this is my business. I run a retail greenhouse, and I spend my whole life growing in hot, sticky greenhouses, and then I run around frantically trying to garden this. People always ask who does this. Mostly I do it myself. I do it after hours. I love how my garden has been turning out, and it has been changing rapidly over the last few years. New ideas, new thoughts, new plants, new concepts. As I've aged, I've gone away from the old 21-year-old Katrina, and I've moved into the 50-plus Katrina, and I've just tried to make this garden beautiful. I'm always enthused to show people, and so now come with me and let's have a look around this garden, and maybe you'll get enthused too. How did this garden obsession begin? Well, frankly, it began because I learned about containers. It started so innocently. It started about 1988 when I first came home to help on this greenhouse business, and there wasn't a lot of room for me in the garden doing this, and there wasn't a lot of room for my skill in other places. So I developed my own skill and learned how to make containers, and I make gosh good containers, let me tell you. And but they weren't that good at the beginning. Partly because I understand containers now, and it's taken a lifetime of understanding containers. Partly because I've invested in good containers with good volumes of soil. And then the next is that the plant material that I put in containers really has come a long ways. I have also had a whole different thought about containers over the years. Whereas many people are still putting containers on decks and patios, I've moved my containers off into the garden setting, away from the decks and the patios, so that they're blended much better into the garden and the surrounding area. So you will see that I put big containers, big pots, not up on the front step, but into the landscape itself. And with that, I'm trying to blend the two mediums of the herbaceous perennial border in with the annual container. Fencing is super duper important. In the history of garden, they often talk of garden rooms and garden places and separate individual thoughts. Fencing and small mini walls make that differential between maybe a cottage garden and a bit more formal garden, or, as often is, the garden and native, or the garden and the back alley. And so fencing and walls create a definition. Not only that, it keeps your eye from moving too quickly and missing the greater part of the garden. We use, and I really like this open weave fencing, and the reason I use an open weave as we do is to give you glimpses and make you want to move through to the next area. It's super important to have fencing dividing off certain areas that you don't want people to see, such as gardens or composts, or something that you have too small of a space but you still require. So the one thing I have learned about fencing is that don't be inhibited, let your mind go, and really try to think outside the box. This fencing is a little different, but it's open. You don't have to have something like this. You can have something very straight and formal. Fencing is really crucial in any garden. Here's something you'll never see a true gardener doing, which is sitting down. I suppose we create these little spaces with the hopes that somebody else could enjoy them, and they just look really great. So I do like to have rest areas built into gardens. Sometimes it can be as simple as just this little deck chair under the birch or out back, and you have to move it every time you want to mow the lawn. It's a place that's calling, or a place that you can head to, or you would fantasize about reading a book. But truthfully, gardeners are always far too busy rushing around reading. Rest areas also can incorporate so many different levels. Now these have these slightly uncomfortable seats that look really great. And you can have the worst looking chair as long as you can plop down into it with a beverage afterwards. The other thing about rest areas is when you sit in it, it gives you a whole different perspective of looking at the garden. Not many people sit and look at their garden. So you've moved from a standing where you're looking down into the plants to that you're sitting and looking into the plants. I often tell my customers when they're trying to plant a new bed is to look at it from all angles. So you do have to pretend you're a tall person and get down on your knees and look at it as a short little child. That will give you a whole overview of how your garden is developing. And so it's a real trick to have your garden looking good when you're standing and really great when you're sitting down. Now this garden that we're in was once a very large continual bed, and it was virtually impossible to keep up. And we couldn't decide where the middle was. So we never knew where to put the height and where to put the low, and if you went from the front to the back or from the sides to the middle. And so the whole bed became a complete hodgepodge mess. The plants in it were very, very good plants, but it had no rhyme or reason, and it wasn't well planned out. And so I simply dug out some of the plants that I wanted to keep and just drove the bobcat through the rest. And what we did was we divided the bed, this huge bed, into small beds that anybody can kneel on the side and weed. And then we kind of gave them each a color. So this one is more pink, and that one is creams and yellows, and that one is yellow, that's more oranges. This one right here is blues and purples. Now we did that simply so that I could have a lot of succession of blooms, and using each small bed as a focal point. And I think that it has worked out very well. This bed was absolutely traumatized during the flood and ended up with about 2.5 feet of mud on it. But due to my lovely family, it's my husband's family, actually cousins, which he has 32 of, they descended on this bed like wolves, and they got in one day the entire bed cleaned off of mud after the flood. And I was able to salvage 90% of all the plants and rebuild it like it was. It's coming along. It's only 5 years after the flood, and this garden only gets, any of my gardens here at Vale's greenhouse, we only get about 76 frost-free days. And when I tell my family that in New Zealand or Australia or England or wherever, they are shocked that we can do this in about 76 frost-free days. The key is correct plant selection, not too optimistic on any one thing that I plant, and I hardly ever compost or fertilizer, so I don't get that full huge burst of go for it. I like things to mature slow and easy and quietly, so they slip in under each of the frost ends. Well, every garden has its own aspects, and this garden, even though it is a small section of my quite small garden, to be truthful, is what I would call the pond area and my hemerocallis bed. Now over here you can see that we have this gorgeous pond, which is 100% artificial. I hadn't really planned on making it this bed, but you get enthusiastic when you're young, and since I've had it about 25 or 30 years now, I suppose I was far more enthusiastic than I should have been. Ponds are very, very difficult, to be honest, and this pond takes a ton of time to start up and to shut down each winter and each spring, but I find it one of my show stoppers. Now, we do sell pond plants here at my business, and so I can focus on that, but what I really like to focus people on is the life cycle of a pond. This pond has a natural type of filter at the head of the waterfall, and so that pumps the water from the bottom of the pond up, and the filter is just a natural rock that is graded through a 50-gallon drum. This is called a biological filter, and it actually it's sort of more symbolic of what you would find in our river systems, where a great deal of the water is traveling underneath the rock, underneath the actual riverbed, filtering itself. That way I can eliminate having algae in my pond more naturally and a little more easily. People often get suspended algae and floated algae because they're trying to use the wrong kind of filter system. And doing a little bit of research gives you a much better scope on how to make your pond clear as mine. It's not necessarily the plants, it is the type of filter you're using. So this bed is basically a hemerocallis bed. And a hemerocallis is the botanical name for the daylily. And yes, the daylily, it is quite explanatory. The flower lasts one day. The application of mass planting like this, which is we have chosen all the same plant here in the front and to the one side of the bed, which is Stelladora. Stelladora is an unusual daylily because it will bloom for about 1 month. And then the rest of the bed has something taller, but also with the same color tone as a daylily, this one being Flava, planted with it. Now, not everybody can do a mass planting like this. And there's lots of reasons that people plant a lot of different things in a bed so they get succession of bloom. But this bed is planted so that we get a big burst of color for about 2.5 to 3 weeks and have it all the same. We also like the fact that the foliage is what's going to be the attractive part for the rest of the summer months. So early in the summer we have this nice foliage coming up, and then in the summer we have this nice bloom, and then the rest of the summer and the fall we do have this nice, very wafty, moving foliage. And the flowers, when we've designed this bed, are actually secondary. We really built it to look and reflect the pond being more like a marsh. Even though this bed is completely dry, it's just to fool the eye so that this looks more like it's right next to the pond, so it gives you that more overall texture, the more feel of being moist. This bed is drop dead dry, and I've always had lots of problems growing things in here. But when I add the daylilies with the pond combination, it gives it that maybe it's giving you the more swampy, marshy look. Well, here we are in what started out as an alpine garden. I really love alpines, but it soon became really apparent once we built this bed that a true alpine garden is not this bed. Alpine gardens are hundreds of man-hours and so difficult because you have to picture yourself the size of an ant and all the other plants big. And so I don't have time to be the size of an ant. I do spend a lot of time on this garden, and it does come through really nicely. So what do I call this garden? Basically I call it a scree garden. And the scree just means that it has a pea gravel top on top, nothing underneath, and it keeps the necks of the plants that I have planted in here dry. Now at one time we were very true to what this garden was to be, which we did native alpines in here, and we built this bed, this little section we built as late as 1993 actually, and the rest of it I have developed on my own over the period of many years, and hauled things out and put things in, as all gardeners do. But I soon kind of left being the purist of a true alpine bed, and what I've done is I've just tried to make it look pretty. And that happens so many different ways, but the thing that I have achieved almost perfection, as long as the deer don't eat them, are my pulsatillas, which is the native crocuses. And they're not all native crocuses. I use the hybrid crocus, which is Calgary's pulsatilla rubra, which is Calgary's pasque flower, which is Calgary's flower. But I have been able to maintain this bed so that it really is a showstopper. Is it a true alpine bed? No. I do call it a scree bed now, or the rockery, or that darn thing I have to weed again. It is difficult weeding this because you do have to get down underneath the scree, the little pebbles. This garden was severely damaged and flooded in the Great Flood of 2013, and so now it has slowly started to recover. I try to keep it as clean as possible. It takes me hundreds of man-hours each year, but I do find this bed very rewarding. And the reason I find it rewarding is it does make me think of Anne Vale, the original owner and family member, because she was passionate about alpines and the Canadian mountains. The next big part of most people's gardens is their front entrance. And that is where people take some of the most pride in, is because it has that good curb appeal street view. And so what people are trying to often attain is 12 months of good look. Well, I have been able to achieve that using globe spruce. This is a Picea globulosa glauca, which means glauca meaning blue. And this is a low grafted one, but you do have to work at keeping it kind of bushy, because you do have to do little snips, little tiny snips in the springtime to keep it going in the right direction. When you plant a tree or a bush like this, you're trying to get the 12 months of use out of it, but I think the most important thing is when it outgrows its space. So many times I have to tell people, look, it's too big now, haul it out. So you get about 10-15 years. Now, the other thing is, of course, is hardscaping. I've used beautiful rock and pillars and these gorgeous urns, which really set the whole front entrance off. Not everybody can do something this grandiose, but don't ever think that over the top can't be done in a garden. Subtle is not what a garden really is. I think that was at first achieved when the first person decided to plant something in the garden. You realize that subtle is never seen ever. If you look over on this side, I have these glorious palm trees, and these palm trees are metal, and they're big and they're huge, but they're not fancy colors, and you would not believe how many customers never even notice these palm trees. They're too subtle. Even though they're large and big, they they're not always very well seen, and it's always quite a surprise to us. So the front entrance garden, couple of rules about that is go big or go home, and over the top is sometimes the way to go. Bigger is better. It's got good street view, and I think this is a living proof. Something that I've also discovered over so many years of trying to garden, and I'm not even that old, just so you know, is that things come in cycles and spurts and spuds. We've just come through the last few years where bedding plants, nobody wanted a bedding plant. Bedding plants were outdated, boring, they want the newest basket stuffer. And here we are standing in front of a bed of these glorious calendula. These calendula are what your grandmother planted. This is a bonbon, and so it's a short mix, inexpensive. You can buy them as a bedding plant. And look what I've tucked in around them. Dusty Miller. Who knew Dusty Miller was such a universal plant? Now, Dusty Miller are a flower arranger's beautiful trick, because a Dusty Miller will dry. It'll look well, and it works well in the bride's bouquet. It looks great on tables. So I love calendula, and so what's old is totally new again. I've rediscovered things that my granny had that I'm really happy with. Annuals, by the way, are amazing. They're inexpensive. You can do so much with them, and look, they're so pretty. Well, one thing for sure, and that southern Alberta has a lot of wind. I'm born and raised in this country, and I always say how much I dislike the wind until you go away, and then you really do miss the wind moving around in the trees. This bed started off with real no fixed idea in my head. All I knew was I dug a hole next to my new wall, and I didn't really know how it was going to play out, but there was a couple of rules in my mind. First, it had to be extremely drought tolerant, because nobody ever thinks about dragging a hose out this far, which is pretty obvious when you see that it is a little distance from the nearest hose bed. But the next thing that I really knew in my heart when I wanted to design this was I really didn't want to stake anything. I had seen families staking delphiniums and trying to keep things from flopping over in the wind. And that's not the type of garden that I really wanted out here. I actually have moved further and further away from that over the years anyway. So this garden, as it has progressed, I started with the idea, and I designed the idea that nothing would be staked here. It would move. Everything in here could move with the wind, could be drought tolerant, and would still have a variety of textures. Now it's been a very hot July here, and you can see that there isn't a lot blooming left in this bed, but it is still very attractive because of how many different textures I have. So in the springtime, when there's a lot of customers milling around my greenhouse business, that you can see that we're going to have peonies blooming and daylilies blooming and other items. But now what I like to see is what you're seeing, exactly what it's supposed to do. In the wind today, it's actually moving, and I think that is a real trick. Nothing here is going to get broken. Nothing here needs a lot of deadheading, and to accept the wind, I think, is 80% of all gardeners' problems. Everybody's always trying to battle something in their garden. They're either battling the wind, they're battling the poor soil, they're battling wet, they're battling dry. I say, let's not battle those and let's work with them now. And so this is kind of what this bed has been designed for. I actually really love it, and you can see I added some wind art just to reflect the fact that wind blow, everything here is going to take it. This garden is what we call the moon garden, or the center bed. And it's one of the most original designed gardens, and it was designed as an English country cottage garden. But when I took this garden over in about 1995, I soon eradicated everything that was too tall and kept falling over. Now, messy gardens are not unbeautiful, but messy gardens are hard to control. And when you're running around with bamboo canes after a major windstorm, really not many people have time for that. So I decreased the height of it. But this garden is still based on as an English country cottage garden. So it is got some cessation of bloom. So cessation of bloom basically means that it starts in early spring, and I try to have something blooming at all times. Now the hemerocallis bed, which we have already looked at, was a mass planting, and that is very good when you want one thing blooming at one time, doing a big coverage. This is so that the smallest little spring flowers start, and we work through up into the Rebecchias later in the fall. Now asters don't tend to do that well here, but we do have some stunning asters. But I don't have them in this garden because by that time I'm so busy putting everything else to bed, I never look up to see the asters. So when this garden is at its best is in mid-June. And that's the time, if you're wanting to see it, it's absolutely stunning. Perennials only bloom for about 2.5 weeks. So you have to have something either just coming on and something fading, something growing, something finishing. You have to have plants that have unusual leaf texture and design, or they have interesting seed pods left behind. Perennial gardening is not for the faint of heart. It's very rewarding, and this type of gardening is probably the hardest to achieve, and very disappointing when the hailstorms come. So we're going to head off on a new adventure, and we're going to see a full wild country full ranch type garden, and then we're going to go to a lovely and beautiful country garden that's much more manicured, and we're trying to drop in on some city folk and see what they're doing too. This garden here I've been dealing with for about 35 years, and I'm quite tired of looking at it. So join me as we head off on these wild adventures to see what other people are doing that's probably far more creative than I ever could.